Sarah Bonharper, the Executive Director of Highland, and it is my pleasure to introduce this program this evening. And I will start by introducing our speakers. Dr. Jajuan Johnson and Dr. Maria DiBenigno. It is a real pleasure to be in this conversation with you, and thank you for being here this evening. Dr. DiBenigno is working on the Mellon project, focused on Highland, specifically on developing exhibit materials and collaborating with Dr. Jajuan Johnson on shared teaching that combines student and community learning. She's also introducing undergraduate researchers to Highland opportunities. Dr. DiBenigno received her PhD from the American Studies program at William & Mary and currently serves as Highland's postdoctoral research associate. Prior to her doctoral studies, she spent several years as a public school teacher, then completed her MA in English at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. At William & Mary, Maria's dissertation studied the relationship between popular culture, public history, and the haunting power of place in the Tidewater region of Virginia. She has worked with several regional history organizations, including the Mariners Museum Library and Menokin Foundation, and instructed courses for William & Mary's American Studies program and National Institute of American History and Democracy, known to many of us as NIAD. Dr. Johnson is the Lemon Project postdoctoral fellow on the Mellon Grant Sharing Authority. He is collaborating with Dr. Maria DiBenigno on shared teaching that combines student and community learning. Dr. Johnson earned a PhD in Heritage Studies from Arkansas State University. He also holds a master's in religion from Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His dissertation, "They Didn't Burn Down Our Spirit: Heritage, Terrorism, and the Resurgence of Black Church Burnings in the Age of Obama," investigates recent Black church arson cases. He explores the impact of burnings on the tangible and intangible heritage of communities. His current research focuses on the terrorization of Black cultural spaces since the 1960s civil rights movement. You two are the right people to be in this conversation, and I couldn't be happier to turn the floor over for your conversation for the collaboration and rapport that you have built over this past semester that our undergraduates are fortunate to be looking forward to for the second semester of your series of courses in the fall. So Dr. DiBenigno and Dr. Johnson, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonharper, for that wonderful introduction. Hello to everyone who has joined us this evening, and hello to my colleague, Dr. DiBenigno. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you as well, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Bonharper. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's good to be with you all on what is a rainy evening here in Williamsburg. Much needed rain.
Yeah. So in terms of our conversation tonight, which is a conversation on better public histories, kind of the way things will flow is this will be a conversation between Dr. DiBenigno and I about our experiences as fellows, her with Highland and me with the Lemon Project. And then we're going to also shift gears and we're going to have a conversation with the audience. So we encourage you all, as we're discussing our various projects and our various lessons that we're gaining in terms of how to do public history better, we encourage you to join the chat. Post a question. We look forward to the dialogue. And before we kind of really dive into it, I want us to kind of ground the conversation, Dr. DiBenigno, in terms of what inspired the topic, better public histories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that you and I have been working since we started in our positions and probably even beforehand on this question of making histories more public, researching specific particular histories and bringing them to audiences that may not have encountered them before. And I think public history museums and historic sites are the spaces where many audiences first encounter particular narratives about the past. And there is just an incredible responsibility in that, I think, for museums and historic sites to be sharing fuller and more inclusive narratives, while also acknowledging what we don't know yet, and the fact that research is always ongoing. And so when I think about imagining better public histories, I think of it as moving towards something better. We're not there yet, but museums and historic sites, museum professionals, archaeologists, architectural historians, oral historians, social historians, community activists. There is a need for collaboration to move towards a better representation of the past in order to, I think, better understand our present moment and think about future collaborations and the possibilities of public history as well, and that it isn't something that is static or in the past. It's still happening.
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
past is very much present. And now that you've keyed in on that point, I want to kind of what I believe drew me to this topic was over the past year, as we have discussed in our class, many different social civic tensions surrounding race, particularly racist violence, state violence against Black women, men, and children. And public history institutions, public history broadly in all of its forms, have been challenged to do some real introspection as it relates to historical omissions, inequities surrounding diversity, and an uneven approach, as I would say, to narrative making, that's told from the perspective of those who are powerful and privileged.
Mm-hmm.
So to do better, there has to be some undoing.
Yes.
And we talked a bit about that and gained so many creative ideas from our students over this past semester in terms of what that looks like. And in these areas, which I'll discuss later on, and we'll both discuss as we talk about how to do better public histories, is based on my insight, not only in terms of my career in public history, but also the insight that I've gained throughout this fellowship. And I believe that this topic, as we've discussed, is highly timely due to even the present efforts to conceal histories of oppressed, marginalized people, and opting from even having discussion around the histories that we're uncomfortable with, our complicated past, the things that make us feel uncomfortable. But the facts are the facts. And I think that's what we're here to do. Our work, we're talking about doing it better. We have to lay bare the truth, even if it's the truth that makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah. And that there is much to repair as well, as you said, on the undoing of it, and order to remake and recreate something that takes more voices into consideration, and not only voices from the past, voices that we recover, from the archives, from, the archaeological excavation, from the storytelling practices, but also listening to voices in the present and bringing in, making an equitable space for different communities to share their own histories as well. And so some of that is certainly wrapped up in this idea of sharing authority or shared authority, that, knowledge is produced in all sorts of spaces by all sorts of individuals and groups, and there isn't just one sole arbiter of it. And I think that's also part of that undoing that you mentioned, that is really difficult, is hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Dr. Johnson, we talk a lot about our experiences and how we got to where we are. And we've shared that a lot with our students. And I'm going to ask you the question that we asked our class this past spring as we got started in the conversation. And it borrows a phrase from Dr. Taya Miles, who I greatly admire in terms of public history and making histories public. How did you come to the landscape of public history? How did it become a space where you have centered yourself, your career? Yeah.
Thanks for that question. I think, as I often have shared, even as I share with the course, I think I came to the landscape of public history in what Kadida Williams calls the home place. In her book, They Left Great Marks on Me, African American Testimonies of Racial Violence. And she talks about these racially homogenous spaces, my space being an African American community, where the elder persons not only reflected on the past and its relationship to the present, but also imagine and cast forth these radical visions of what our lives could be in these spaces. So through listening to oral history, lore, learning about family history, I discovered not only do people tell stories, but objects, lands also hold a powerful narrative. And so in short, I entered the terrain of public history really through the preservation of local African-American history and culture. And largely, as I've talked about, as taught to me by my grandmother, who was a griot and oral historian of sorts. So that was my introduction to this. And most of that informs the methodologies that I presently use in my field.
Yeah.
And what about
a similar structure in the terms of familial history and listening to stories. My family, my teachers. I am an avid reader. I always was. And as a child, I was always drawn to historical fiction. And so I came to seek those stories that were buried in some of the novels that I read as a child, books by authors like Anne Rinaldi, Scott Odell, just narratives that were rooted in historical accuracy. And I still find these types of more imaginative texts to be important repositories of what Clint Smith has called the granular details of history, the pay attention moments of human experience, and how how we can read, as you say, a historic place as we might read a document, and it requires a different type of reading. But I feel that, from an early age, that was something I really liked doing. And I think that that's what is so spectacular, especially about working at Highland, is the house as artifact, the walls as text, the archaeology that is ongoing right now, what that is showing us about the past and how we can learn from that. So I think that this is a quote from Wyoni Edwards Ingram, but she talks about it's the imagined, not the imaginary. So it's not about making stuff up. It's about thinking more broadly and expansively about what hasn't been written down in sort of these traditional narratives that were written primarily by upper class white men and women. So yeah.
There's a lot I can talk about on that spot in terms of these imagined, the ways that we expand the narrative, which I guess I'll talk about when I get to the next portion. Next 2 points, we get ahead of myself,
or you can go there now.
Much of that, even with our projects, you with Highland, me with the Lemon Project, which is a phenomenal initiative that William and Mary, both entities are. And we talked about some of the similarities and differences in that. And I guess I'll just kind of lead it with the Lemon Project, and then you can talk about Highland, because I believe that Lemon Project in and of itself is really a trailblazer among initiatives in higher education focused on the study of slavery and its afterlives, and realizing that it's not enough to simply produce reports or research, but to critically engage on all levels with our students, with administrators, the broader community, in the hopes of producing systemic changes within our institutions. And so I do believe that what we do, or what we choose not to do, is reflective of our values. And I've had a phenomenal experience of working with wonderful colleagues such as Dr. Jody Allen and Dr. Sarah Thomas, who have a deep conviction about this work.
Mhm.
And like I said, there's so many similarities, and with a lot of similarities, probably more likes than differences
Mhm.
in our works. But I wanted to underscore that as I talk about just the passion that's within at the crux of what we do
Mhm.
in our programs. And for folks who want to know a bit more about it, our goals, which is long-term research and to understand and chronicle, preserve African American history, and within Edward and Mary and the surrounding community, and the ways that we do that via the reports, via the oral history work that we've done, the genealogy work that we're doing, and the ways that we are building bridges with William and Mary in the greater Tidewater region with the projects such as what we've done this past semester.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different aspects where our work intersects. So we can talk about that, or we can, because I don't think there are many differences really, when I really think about it. What is
Yeah.
your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it just maybe in terms of, I am working on label text for the reinterpretation. But, you and I are still reading, much of the same primary and secondary sources. We certainly, I think, share them and bounce ideas off of each other when it comes to how best to represent the past or how best to tell these stories. I think, certainly your genealogical research is just incredibly important, not only for the university, but for the community at large. And I think continuing to build those relationships. And that's something that I think is really amazing about not only the larger Sharing Authority initiative, but also just our interactions in the world of COVID. I mean, just getting to know each other on Zoom and getting to know our students and our supervisors, our directors, in a remote space, and how that has almost become its own system of sharing ideas that has happened on the computer.
Absolutely.
So I think, yeah, to a certain degree, our, the work that we are doing is, more similar than it is different. And certainly the co-instructing has been the highlight, has been a highlight of what is just a continually, intellectually and just wonderful experience.
So I think we've also been really creating pathways for more type of reparative work within our communities. The work that you all are doing with the descendant community there, the work with our descendant community that we're engaging with. I think the ways that we engage students with the community this past semester, I think a lot of inroads were made in that a lot of knowledge was shared.
Yeah.
And there was a lot happening in that space. And wonderful things in terms of the sharing of ideas. What's something that really resonated with you in that moment as our descendant community members were engaging with students in that classroom setting?
I learned so much this last semester, and so much of it was sitting back and letting the class interact and engage with each other and with the ideas and the materials that we presented. And so I loved my interactions with our community members. We had a group of community registrants from all over Virginia and Washington, D.C. And that was an experience that I don't think very many undergraduate students have, is that ability to interact not only with some of the leading museum and public historians, or museum staff and public historians that we had as guest speakers, but then also listening to the experiences of not only their peers, but also the community members who just brought an incredible depth of knowledge and history, to the class discussion. And we were able to cover not only, histories related to Highland and James Monroe and, the broader, Virginia landscape of the early 19th century, but we also touched upon how there are similar stories, and then there are different stories that range across the country. And frankly, I think, we could even have a more global conversation about museums and stories and, whose voice is in the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which leads to how we work together.
Yeah. How do we work together?
Yeah, well, I think we've I think that we both, have deep convictions about doing public history in a way that's equitable.
Yes.
And ultimately, I think our approach centers on the needs of the community and diverse groups of people who are the makers of the stories
Mm-hmm.
we curate. So in thinking about the ways that we work together, even though our backgrounds are just slightly different, the ways that we've identified to engage descendant community members with our courses, and
Mm-hmm.
especially open to their needs,
Yeah.
and being providing even technical assistance in
Mm-hmm.
some areas based on the projects that interest them.
Yeah.
Discussing and recommending resources that enhance their work, and that even enhance our work.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the teaching, merging our areas of expertise in class lectures and discussions, but also leaving that space for the students to interject in this shared learning environment.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to the space that I think we're even upcoming, I think next year, co-presenting and supporting each other's programs and the ways and the way that we're currently galvanizing other scholars around the discussion with the participation in our 22 National Council on Public History meeting session that we're doing. So those are a few things that kind of come to mind in terms of the ways that that we've been collaborating. But I think at the crux of it is this deep commitment to do public history in an equitable way.
Yes. Yes. And listening and asking for feedback, and not only touching base with each other about, what did you think of that? Does this work? What might work better? But also asking our students for that feedback, mid-semester, getting their input on how the class was progressing and what they enjoyed, what they wanted to know more about, what might not be working. And so I think that constant, not only self-evaluation, but community evaluation is certainly, I think, at the crux of some of our responsibilities too, to ask for feedback and what are the community needs, as opposed to what are my individual sort of interior scholarly needs. And I, often looking, to you for expertise on your, your research within the field of heritage studies and oral history. And then certainly, I think bringing together our guest speakers for the class were based on our kind of our own community of colleagues. That are now, I think, a broader, more, it brought together a wonderful group of voices. And some of our students have even reached out to those guest speakers. So I think that's creating its own community, and not only having our students learn a little bit about networking and professionalization, but also, just exchanging ideas and listening and considering, other paths into public history and museum studies and the world of this world of heritage. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what most resonated with me, is that we brought several options forward through our visitors.
Mhm.
That there's not this one way, that there are many pathways in this work that you can take. And I think we underscored that quite well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, asking them to, think expansively about what is a stakeholder. What
Yeah,
does that mean and who does it refer to?
yeah,
And then also considering community members that are not engaged or interested in engaging. And recognizing that historic sites also have institutional histories
absolutely.
that require attention, and that may or may not be bound up in the narrative that's being presented, on guided tours. So that is also something that I hope our students took away, was to consider that as well.
I agree, because when I think about this whole community-based participatory model, there's a space not to participate.
Mhm.
And not to interact.
Yeah.
When we're doing work in our communities, our job is not to impose anything.
Mhm.
We are there to serve our to serve the community, and in ways that they would want to be involved. And so I think it's important to always remember that there's a space to say, I don't want to be involved,
Yes.
and no explanation is needed for that.
Yes. Yeah, and that is respecting that.
Mhm.
I know some of our students that are interested in engaging with communities that they are not a member of,
Right.
that the requirement to get to know
Mhm.
those individuals in that group of people, and then also respect the lack of response, or
Yeah.
what that silence might mean, that has maybe nothing to do with you, or everything to do with you.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so what are you reading right now?
Let's see.
I know we are in the process of syllabus creating for the fall course, but I know that I always learn from you, and
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 likewise.
so what are you reading right now? What are you working through?
I'm reading so many books, but I just completed this wonderful book, new release by Dr. Elena Roberts, who's a historian. And the book is I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. And I found this book to be really interesting because she's using genealogy in her family story to really provide an in-depth analysis of Indian territory in the Reconstruction era.
Wonderful.
Particularly those who migrated to the Indian territory willingly or unwillingly, and participated in the process of settler colonialism.
Mhm.
And so she really prompted me to think more deeply about, or is prompting me to think more deeply about how African Americans were experiencing Reconstruction in various regions, from Indian territory to the Deep South. Um, and I think it speaks to this broader narrative that our experiences, we're not a monolith. And so how
Mhm.
are people in different areas really experiencing this period of Reconstruction? So that's what I'm kind of thinking about now. That's the thought that this book has prompted. And I'm also reading, I don't mind sharing another one. Uh, there's a lot of conversation, as you know, around reparations. So I'm
Yeah.
reading this book called Repair,
Yeah.
um, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition by Dr. Anne Frank, which is a wonderful text. And she's putting forth an idea of an incomplete emancipation, and that if
Mm.
African Americans, people who were formerly enslaved, are to, if we want to really finish it, they were, of course, as we know, were emancipated with no resources to really build a life, to really make a life. So that, thus, as she's putting forth, is an incomplete emancipation. So I'm thinking about that in terms of the broader conversation around race relations and reparations. What does this fully encompass, this incomplete emancipation, and what is its relevance at this present moment?
Yeah.
What are the implications of that?
Yeah.
What about you?
You said that was Anne. You said Dr. Anne Frank.
And Catherine Frank.
Anne Frank.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Sorry. So I am actually I'm rereading Never Caught, the Washington's relentless pursuit of their runaway slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. And it's about an enslaved woman who went with George and Martha Washington to Philadelphia, where then she self-emancipated towards the end, I think, of his third presidential term, and just simply refused to go back.
Yeah.
And so as a little bit of a plug, I'm going to be leading Highland's virtual book club next week. And this is the reading, the book that we'll be talking about. But on this second read, I've really been struck by Professor Dunbar's incredible insight into the responsibilities that that an enslaved woman like Ona Judge would be required to do, would be forced to do. And so some of that has been incredibly helpful as we're working on the reinterpretation of the guest house at Highland and thinking about how enslaved women would experience these spaces, how they would, what their labor would be. And so I've just found it to be an incredible narrative of this individual, of this woman, and really focusing on her humanity in really important and necessary ways. And then the other book that I have started to read, it's a novel, but by Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer, which is a reimagining of the experience of enslavement and the self-emancipation and the Underground Railroad. So there are touches of magical realism. I've just started that, but I listened to a spectacular interview with him from 2019, he being Coates, about the idea of magic and escape. And so that's what I'm reading right now. And I highly recommend both.
Great.
Yeah.
I think you're on mute.
I was not only on mute, but I was off camera. Now I'm both back. So you guys, I am just enthralled sitting here listening and really captivated. And it's clear to me from our audience questions that are coming, that other people are also just hanging on every word and eager to join the conversation. I imagine that you both could continue and maybe we return to this, but if you're willing to entertain a few audience questions at this point, then we'll see how our time goes and we'll move this in. Not in particular order, but tying to several things that you've said, and see if we can drop in on these. You both mentioned that some people, we're talking about community histories, may not want to participate in studies and projects. You talked really eloquently about leaving space for not participating and not even explaining that, that there's no requirement of explaining. And our audience member asks whether there's a major reason or two that you would like to cite about that, excluding things that would clearly impede participation, such as personal issues of no time or family illness. Something. Could you expound a little bit on that, on those choices of perhaps not participating at this time?
Yeah.
Well, I think I've seen many cases, where there has been between institutions this major chasm. There's trauma present based on whether a community they feel that they have been exploited in research, or just don't trust it. Or maybe there's just been a breach of confidence over time that really doesn't make way for where there's a lot of pain and there's some trauma there, and people just simply don't want to participate. And so there's some skepticism. And I've worked with projects with persons. For an example, I was working on is when I was in Arkansas, and it was a woman whom I wanted to interview, and she had attended, I believe, Central High School, which had very traumatic experiences with that, and was suffering from post-traumatic stress, PTSD, as related to that experience. So she did not want to participate based on those memories and those very traumatic circumstances. So I think sometimes there is this transgenerational trauma. There's collective memory. There's so many reasons why people may not want to participate. In terms of, in this community, there is, and we have to lay the truth bare, there are some bad relationships between the college and the African American community. And so there are those who simply will object to participate. And there, on the other side, there are those who feel that there's a space to participate and choose to do so. So there's so many different reasons why, and I think it's important to be understanding as to those reasons that I've just kind of laid out. And this kind of work is laborious, right? it can be, I mean, the telling of stories, the preservation process, whether that's a structure, whether that's for history initiatives, sometimes reliving experiences can be too daunting for someone. So that's just a couple of my perspectives on it. What are your thoughts, Dr. DiBenigno?
Yeah, I think that often it is either personal or traumas inflicted by institutions, or just simply the practices of white supremacy and racist approaches to different communities in areas by a predominantly white institution to a community of color. So that is, I think that is often there. I also think that there is a real, I think that scholars in general need to reflect on what they're doing for a community when they study said community.
Absolutely.
And this is something that I came up in our class multiple times, was this notion of taking for research and writing something and then leaving completely, and not considering how does this research help a community, and help broadly defined, right? Like whether it's bringing economic engines into a community, or it's just simply being a friend. And that's not to say that research is some sort of this sort of savior complex, although sometimes that can be it too, but or that can be the motivator. But yeah, I think there's just a real there's a history of that type of interaction with communities, especially I think by people who are not a part of that community, whether it is race or class or gender identity, gender expression. So, and I think that's across the board. And I say scholars, and I use that term broadly as well, because, people doing this type of research, there's a legacy to it that is not always addressed. And again, I think, sometimes younger, maybe less experienced scholars don't know it. And so that requires additional layers and levels of study, and empathy, frankly, just common decency sometimes.
And not seeing the community input as a friendly add-on. People know when you're genuine in your approach. Are you doing something to appease the partners, rather than seeing engagement and demonstrating that this is a necessary component of the research process or whatever project that is taking place. And so we put forth many ideas this past semester in our course. And matter of fact, next semester, we're going to deal with this critical component again, in terms of when in terms of our dealing with African American research methods and resources, and in broaching, how do you broach communities where there's this skepticism, where there's this distrust and understandable distrust?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think and thank you for that. And I hear from both of you the real empathy that grounds your work and the real sort of place that you have created or acknowledged for community engagement that is not an add-on, that is really a central piece. And I really admire the way, the course this semester really stepped into that realm in a lot of meaningful ways and demonstrated and explored that and really took the university in a direction that I think is helpful in so many ways. And our next question comes from Terry Myers, whom we know. And it's two parts. The first one is, how are descendant communities actually involved in the formation of a public history narrative? Is it mainly family and oral history? Have you come across documents or artifacts in their possession that can illuminate the past? Then I'll give you part two, which I think is specifically for Dr. Johnson. And in connection with William and Mary, are we making connections to a descendant community? Are they on board with the? Is there any, and parenthetically understandable, of course, which you've also said, resistance or skepticism from them? So that's kind of a big two parts.
Yeah. Did you want to take the first part, Maria?
Yeah. So obvious, Highland has just a spectacular council of descendant advisors that I have worked with since I started this position in August of last year of 2020. But I know, Dr. Von Harper, you have, shared the interpretive drafts with our council to receive feedback on label direction and exhibit design. Our council of advisors are just incredibly generous with their time and meeting with the students as well at William and Mary and other communities, within Central Virginia and other spaces that are interested in this type of research. So I think their incredible perspective and their own familial research and their own historical perspectives and understanding and reading have certainly, I think, illuminated the direction for the reinterpretation of the guest house at Highland. In the past, I have been privileged to work with the African American Advisory Board that is operating at Minokin in Warsaw, Virginia. And in that instance, the African American community brought incredible depth of their own family history, sharing their cookbooks and which were historical texts that shared narratives from their family life. They were just incredibly generous with sharing. We were doing genealogical research, so we were trying to trace one particular family. So that was an instance of just incredible historical import that was within the family's archives. So I listened with great interest this semester, Dr. Johnson, to when we had Dr. Doretha Williams came and spoke about the Smith project through the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and this notion of preserving these types of archives for communities, not always for the benefit of the museum, not always to put up on a website and make available, but for the family to have that and be able to share it with their own descendants. So I think that was a little bit long-winded, but that's something I've seen, that's just been a spectacular voice. And just as has been said before, more eloquently than me, just incredibly generous research and involvement.
And to Dr. Ameyer's question, yes, we are making connections with the community, with the descendant community in some meaningful ways. Of course, much of this work started before I started as a fellow, because the Lemon Project has had really wonderful relationships, or has wonderful relationships in the Williamsburg community and even the surrounding community. But one of the ways that we have been making connections with the community has been through the workshops that we've been doing for our genealogy program, and which I consider a community-based participatory research initiative, in that we're also providing, this is a form of capacity building, bringing in experts, bringing in friends and partners from other institutions who are doing these wonderful workshops, which we will have 3 over the summer. And in the interim, between those workshops, I'll be doing special breakout sessions, learning sessions with those individuals who are participating. I've been very pleased with those who have been signing up on our genealogy intake form for advisement. I've consulted students. I'm working closely with some families, some of them not in Williamsburg, but outside of Williamsburg, who have connections. One of the ways that I've been connecting with them have been through some of our partners, such as Dr. Shelley Murphy at UVA. She and I collaborate on many levels, and oftentimes she'll send a family my way whose name may be on my list. And so I've been able to really, it's just some amazing work that you're going to learn about later on, collaborating with these wonderful people who just follow up with an inquiry. You know, is my ancestor on your list of enslaved persons? I dig a little bit deeper and we find information. And we're now working on this really great case study with a descendant community member who lives in DC. And I won't go too much into detail, as I want to get her permission before I discuss anything. But again, that's a part of the trust building process as well, is that we have a wonderful relationship, and we have been really working together to expand her family's the narrative and finding many direct connections with the college. So all of the encounters that I've had with people is that they've been really on board with it. They've been on board with the project. They enjoy the programs. They show up in mass. Typically, we've had between 35 to 50 attendees. And I'm also providing direct consultation to those who are interested, and also linking them to other organizations, particularly genealogical societies, Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Societies being one of those who has a robust membership in this area. But there are those who are participants in our program who I encourage to be a part of that connection, as well as the Newport News African American Historical Society. So to the extent that it's possible during the pandemic, I think we've been doing pretty good in terms of the outreach, and I'm really pleased with the receptivity of the community. I haven't encountered much skepticism. People have a genuine interest about knowing about their family history and their connection possibly to William and Mary. And interestingly, we found several cases where we have concrete evidence that there is some connection.
Well, thank you. And it's really exciting to hear about stuff that are very real and very based. So thank you for that. So a question also about recent objections, in particular an article in the New York Times objecting to the influence of critical race theory on the teaching of history. Mm-hmm. The article focused mainly on universities and K-12 schools. And how do you feel about this issue in terms of public history education, say in museums and or historical sites, places like Highland? How do you respond? How do you think about that in this setting?
Yeah.
Did you want?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's an important one too.
Yeah, and I would say there's maybe not a single answer, but we can certainly talk about it for a bit.
I'm thinking about this effort to tee up this culture. Number one, I think there's a lack of understanding as to what critical race theory really is, and its place in having a critical understanding of race and how racism underpins all of the systems in our society. And so I think in terms of its uses, I think number one, there's been a lack of understanding. Number two, in terms of its uses, I think it has a place in public history. And I think that's what we've kind of been saying, really, in our work, that there are oppressive structures at play that permeate every aspect of our society, that being the work that we do in public history. So in terms of, I forget the second part of that question, but in terms of how we're grappling with that, I think it has a place, but I think there's also a misunderstanding in terms of what it is. And so I don't know how we move beyond that in terms of creating some critical dialogue around it if there's not a willingness to understand it and its place.
Do you think, I'm going to jump in, do you think it's the place of public history sites or historical places like Highland to make that leap and create that education?
I think it is. For these particular sites that are, I mean, if we look at the origin of many of these sites, I mean, look at the origin of Highland. I don't think you can sidestep a critical approach in using this critical race theory and it underpinning the education work that you're doing and what have you. I think there has to be a dynamic of that. And I think in many ways that's being done by looking deeply at the ways that supremacist ideology, white supremacist ideology has shaped and molded our public histories. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It does make a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think I agree with Dr. Johnson. I think there's a fundamental understanding of what critical race theory is to begin with. And I think it's become it's a bad word now without any, critical constructive analysis of the fact that many of its central tenets you have already encountered, you have already learned about. These, thinking about white supremacy, thinking about the histories that have been privileged at museums and historic sites throughout the generations of visitors.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the way that we do that, if we are using museums and historic sites as classrooms, as learning laboratories, as spaces for instruction, it's by telling that full, inclusive, multivocal, polyvocal narrative, where we show how intertwined these questions of race and enslavement and politics and interpersonal relationships, were woven into the very fabric of some of these systems. And so I think that you can have these conversations by accurately, interpreting what we know at this point. And and just sharing that incredibly complex history. I think that that's what makes visiting a historic site so powerful for some people is that you're, in that place and thinking about these things. There's an experiential component to it that I don't always completely understand, but it is very individual. And I think in those individual moments, we can talk about individual stories that, whether people, our visitors realize it or not, are critically examining the foundations of,
I think
race and racism in our country. I mean, I think that these are spaces for those conversations, and I think we do it by telling, the full story. To quote someone much more eloquent than me. Dr. Johnson, I feel like I spoke over you. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I was just talking about critical race theory starting with that idea that you cannot educate anyone, particularly young people or anyone, to take up their responsibilities as citizens unless you give them a critical racial literacy.
Yeah.
And understanding. I don't know how it can be done without that. And I think in terms of this theory, it's really dealing with these deeply oppressive structures underpinned by racism, white supremacy. And so I don't know how you can effectively, as a public history institution, as a public trust, really effectively deal with this narrative if that is not acknowledged and fully dealt, and not as an add-on, but recognizing that this is a critical dynamic to the work that we're doing.
What I hear you both saying is that by doing the kind of public history
Yes.
we are doing in these places,
Mhm.
we are providing that cultural literacy that
Yes.
is required. So we don't maybe need to stand at a podium and say this is critical race theory, but we need to provide those essential narratives that create part of the framework of American history and that are about race, and in a multivocal, multi-perspective, thoughtful way.
And that really underpinned our course this semester. I don't
Mhm.
think we even used the word critical race theory, but we were doing it. I mean, there were people in our class, community members, speaking directly to their experience of living in a segregated society, growing up in a community where their descendants, I mean, their ancestors have been enslaved in this space. And given the historical arc of the current implications of that, bringing that to this space and having critical dialogue surrounding it, that's critical race theory at its at work. So
Yeah. And so in that way, I can't help but think, yeah, as as you just said, Dr. Bon Harper, it doesn't have to be like PowerPoint critical race theory, but I think that museums and historic sites for so long were viewed as these static, innocuous spaces. And I think it's important to consider some of the harm that has been done at historic sites and museums in advancing, again, this a notion of whiteness as bestness, and white history as the only history, and sort of one kind of focus. Yeah, so I just can't help but think, it's already happening in some places, in many places, which I am happy to hear, especially based on the past semester and what our students uncovered and what our community members shared.
And what they were reimagining, because every
Yeah.
project that they in these imagined museums was underpinned by many by critical race theory. Although they didn't realize that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, we had them imagine their own museums and their own mission and vision for that institution. And so many of them just went in directions I could not have imagined. And it was spectacular. And it made me, incredibly hopeful for, these future scholars, some of them that are interested in the field of public history and also focused on better public histories too. So, yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Dr. DiBenigno. Thank you to our amazing audience who provided some great questions and who I think we all might want to listen to you for much longer and really, really take to heart a lot of what you're saying. I feel really hopeful listening to you. If you'll indulge me in 30 seconds that I didn't prepare you for, just a lightning round of I know both of you are working on projects for the summer. We've talked a lot about this incredible conversation you had across the university, the boundary of the university, within and in the community simultaneously during the spring semester. You'll be doing another course in the fall. How about your summer? Just a real lightning round, 1 or 2 seconds on what are you most looking forward to accomplishing with your summer?
wow. Well, for me, I'm looking forward to I've been working on, I'm doing actually a presentation at the 5th Global Meeting on Slavery Past, Present, and Future, where I'm going to talk about shared authority, oral history, genealogy, and the ways that we're expanding the narrative of persons who were enslaved. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm also developing a chapter for submission that spans, that is taken, kind of connected to my dissertation. So I'm finding that the dissertation is actually quite useful now in terms of, being able to develop some work out of it. Of course, you always need that time away. And then I'm also going to relax. I'm going to find time for respite. Maybe go to the beach down in Hampton, spend some time, tour some spots and places, come out to Highland to visit.
Yes.
Yay.
Yes.
So yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. DiBenigno, how about you?
I am going to also revisit a chapter for my dissertation that I would like to do a little bit more with, that will require some research enrichment that I was unable to do due to pandemic restrictions. And I'm also really excited to be working with some undergraduate students at William and Mary on 3 separate projects that are very uniquely tied to not only the reinterpretation of the guest house, but also frankly, some of my research interests about shifts and changes in interpretation, and how sites tell stories and what sources they are using, sort of thinking about the institutional histories within the historic site. So really excited to be working with some students that were a part of our class, and then also forward thinking for the fall as well. So doing some reading in advance of the fall.
Thank you. Thank you both for not minding too much being put on the spot. And we're excited to hear both the current thinking and the next steps. So thank you. So I would like to say good night to our audience. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for engaging in what I feel is an important conversation, what I personally have gained a lot from being a part of. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
See ya.